Hello, everybody. So our next talk is Mark Shuttleworth from Canonical and Ubuntu. He's going to be talking about the design and implementation of the Unity netbook user experience. So I don't think he needs much more introduction. Mark Shuttleworth.
Thank you. It's a little early to be getting this message over here. Anyway, it's very nice to be here, and great to be back at DevConf. Lots of familiar faces, lots of old friends. Is anybody here actually running Unity at the moment? Evan, a couple of other folks? All right. So Unity is a culmination of several years' work, inspired initially by this sort of explosion in interest in Linux on netbooks. We were approached by a couple of companies from out in Taiwan who wanted to ship Linux on netbooks, but they wanted simplified user interfaces, essentially. And so that kicked off a process which has culminated now in Unity. Within Canonical, my job description has changed. I'm no longer the CEO. That's gone to a much more capable woman than I am. And in return, I get to focus on just the pieces that I'm really interested in. The design of Unity is one of those pieces. So we have a design team based in London who are responsible for all of the visual and user interaction design that we're doing at Canonical. And so they're essentially driving this process. But it is an open design process. There is a mailing list called Etana, and we have quite a lot of traffic on that. And we use that as a forum for debating many of the changes that get made, and also just the broader theme of design in Ubuntu and in free software generally. So I'll start off with just going back through where Unity came from. This is the first version of UNR. And there are a couple of things that sort of stand out about it. First, it's very much a full screen kind of experience. A lot of the inspiration for this work came from the PlayStation, essentially, from game consoles. And the idea of thinking of the computer more as a device that you use than as a general purpose computer where you're sort of manipulating lots of different pieces of information. So much bigger icons, because another sort of piece of inspiration was coming from the idea that this is all ultimately got to end up being touchable. Touch is very much a sort of a primary interface technique. We preserved quite a lot of the semantics of the GNOME desktop. Initially, you can see, for example, the categories that come from the applications menu in a typical GNOME desktop today. And you can also see places. Those are mapped straight from GNOME, essentially, just from the underlying infrastructure. So we try to reuse as much of that as possible, but focus on presenting people with just the pieces that they're likely to be interested in, and just in a way that's sort of simpler for the average user to navigate. And the feedback on this one was pretty good. I think Toshiba shipped it, Dell shipped it, a couple of other OEMs shipped it, and generally got pretty good feedback. It also got picked up in quite a few different places. Jolly Cloud based some of their initial work on it, and a couple of distros used it as a sort of as a netbook interface. For the next revision of the interface, we were trying to sort of make it relax a little bit. So you can see here we took away the idea of sort of places on the right and integrated all of that. We still kept the categories, and so we're still mapping from this underlying idea of a categorized set of software on the desktop. This is what we did with places. Essentially, we made it its own sort of category in that list. And then, based on all of this experience, we started the Unity design process. We knew that we were going to do a bunch of more work with OEMs, and they wanted an interface that would be appropriate, for the projects that they had in mind. We also knew that starting quickly, booting quickly was a real priority, and so we were willing to essentially replace big chunks of infrastructure with completely new code if we thought that we could make things more lightweight. And Unity was in development for about 8 months, and it first showed up in this, which is Ubuntu Lite. And so the requirements for Ubuntu Lite were to produce a really stripped down system, which would mainly be used for web browsing, It was designed for essentially a dual boot sort of environment with OEMs, and was really just designed to be running 3 or 4 applications, but which preserved enough of the core of the system that potentially over time it could be upgraded to a full desktop experience. So the idea with this is actually to install it on machines that are going out in the US and in Europe, Windows on them. So this is a dual boot environment. And for us, that's a really cool idea to try and get to raise the amount of exposure that Linux gets. At the moment, for people, it's a choice. You have to either get a machine with Windows or get a machine with Linux. We figured if we could get this to be successful and popular, you'd have a lot more people who are at least getting familiar with the interface, familiar with the basic ideas, and could then easily upgrade to a full system, sort of removing the Windows partition. This little icon over here actually is the sort of dual boot control mechanism over there. And as you can see, we really sort of relaxed it completely, so that categorized application sort of structure is gone, and we just have a sort of favorite applications. So that was one chunk of work. Another chunk of work was up on the top right there, what we call the indicators. But there are all sorts of problems with this. There's no mechanisms, for example, to sort of add and remove applications. There's no mechanisms there for dealing with sort of lots of files in a traditional way. And so in the run-up to the last UDS, we did a whole bunch of design work for, again, a sort of a full-screen experience that we call the dash that would fit in over here. And so the dash is just a full-screen place for dealing with chunks, lots of files or lots of applications, and we have ideas about what else might go in there as well, like contacts and things like that. And so we mapped places up there to the top into the sort of places bar, and then created this space over here, which is the dash. And that's not been implemented. It went into Maverick a month or so ago, and it looks like this. So now we have the launcher. We have the dash in the middle over here, places driving the dash essentially, and indicators up there. And that's roughly what Unity is all about. So in the design process, one of the really interesting things about it is embracing constraints. And it's very interesting. That's a very difficult thing for an open source community to do. One of the wonderful things about the open source community is that it grows as a function of the number of people joining it and their interests. So someone will write a tool that works with MySQL as a database. Someone else joins the community and they update it to work with Postgres as well. Someone else joins the community and they figure out how to make it work with NoSQL databases, and so it rolls, right? But that's kind of in opposition to this idea that really great design comes from effectively reducing your options and reducing and imposing constraints essentially on the process. So we figure out how to balance that. We have lots of very vigorous conversations, but these are the sorts of constraints that we apply to ourselves in the design process. Vertical pixels are the most precious kind of real estate on the screen. So there are many decisions and trade-offs that have been made in Unity with a very specific goal of maximizing the number of vertical pixels. Remember, netbooks are with the primary audience, and they've got screens which are typically wide but not very deep. Even if when you're on a larger screen, typically you're spending all day in the browser or all day in a particular application. You don't want a lot of Chrome cluttering up the screen. And if you look at this, a typical desktop today, I don't know if you look at your desktops, amongst people who haven't actually gone in and really configured the system, often there's just huge amounts of wasted space at the top and the bottom of the screen. So we put a lot of effort into basically figuring out how to put pieces together in more and more efficient ways, and the trade-offs associated with that. For the netbook interface, we figured that we didn't want people to spend a lot of time doing window management. So the idea was to figure out how to make it sort of maximized all the time. And so you see, again, a lot of assumptions about how window management would work. And then also just this idea that ultimately touch is going to be a primary method of interaction. So we didn't want to do stuff that ultimately was really dependent on having a pixel-perfect pointer, because we just don't think that you'll have that on lots of the machines that people will want to use Unity. In terms of sources of inspiration, the console really is a great source of inspiration for us, and that's true, I think, for a number of reasons. One, there's an enormous amount of innovation that happens in the console space. Colin was talking earlier about how Linux is so mission critical now that it's hard to really radically innovate in that. And the same is true of the desktop. Microsoft, Apple, GNOME, KDE. It's really hard to motivate for radical innovation because you're going to break something from somewhere. But in the gaming space, there are no constraints. It's completely free form. It's not mission critical. So in many senses, that's an environment that's been free to innovate and free to adopt ideas more quickly. So I'm not saying we spent a lot of time playing games during the Unity design process, but there's definitely a feel, if you use it, of kind of something that comes from a gaming environment. Light is a theme that we're using. So visually, you'll see a lot of the stuff is designed and drawn with the idea of almost light coming through, light coming out of the screen. Looking at the graphics, we use a lot of OpenGL in the implementation, and that's specifically so that we can get at the more modern capabilities of graphics accelerated hardware. And so a lot of the effects and so on are actually implemented in GL directly, and that's only going to increase. And then the last sort of bit of inspiration we had was that we want people to be able to search for everything rather than navigating to anything. So in the Dash in particular, search is the primary means by which you would find something. So the idea is if your search is really, really good, then in just a couple of keystrokes, you can present people with something that they can just touch. And so we're trying to get rid of the idea of navigating through hierarchies and just search and touch as the two sort of ways to get to stuff, get stuff activated, get out of stuff. Okay, so that's the background. What are all the different kinds of pieces of technology that come together in this? Well, one of the first things that we decided to embrace because of the focus on the netbook was the idea of a panel-based menu. So remember I said we're optimizing for maximized applications, which means typically you're only working on one application at a time. And so the potential disconnect that some people experience when you use a panel-based menu on a large screen monitor with multiple windows, and the menu is sort of very disconnected from the window, those effects are diminished in a netbook type environment. So we decided to adopt that. So we looked at the existing state. That there was an effort to do this in GNOME some time ago. In KDE, they used to have this capability in KDE 3, I think, but it hasn't been re-implemented in KDE 4. And this has been a focus of work. We couldn't reuse the old GNOME one because just of the way it interacts with GTK, it was a bit low level. And so what we did is we built a protocol over dbus where you can export menus over dbus. And then we've got a plugin for a loadable module for GTK and a loadable module for Qt, which in both cases allow the menu to be exported over dbus. So this is really great. That top menu over there is being rendered actually by Unity, and the application just sends its menu to Unity over dbus. We've got it working, roughly working now for both Qt and GTK apps, so they work well. We don't have it working for the Zool-based apps, so Firefox and Thunderbird. And we also don't have it working for OpenOffice, but those will come. Essentially, it's just a question of implementing the hooks in the toolkit to talk to dbus, and there's sort of client-side libraries that simplify all of that. That work was sort of promoted and published as a freedesktop.org standard. A lot of what we're trying to do, we're trying to sort of elevate the state of the art and then make sure that it works well across both GNOME and KDE, and so a lot of the appropriate forums for the conversations are sometimes like in freedesktop.org. This is the focus of a lot of work right now in 10.10 because this is the sort of single biggest change that's happening in the netbook edition for 10.10. And so the always amazing George, where's George, is leading the charge. And I think there's a list of 80 or so applications that we need to sort of engage with. One of the assumptions, one of the things that, if we're going to export stuff over dbus, it means that you have to have a fairly standard model of what a menu can look like. And so there's been, what we're doing is going through all the applications and trying to find places where people have done stuff in sort of custom or unusual ways, and then mapping that to a more standardized sort of model of a menu, and then it works over dbus menu. So that's that. So it was interesting. The global menu guys originally proposed to GNOME that GNOME adopt this approach, but it was rejected. It works very well on netbooks, and because of the way we've implemented now, you can actually just put an applet on a GNOME panel plugin and use it on the desktop as well. So I think most of the folks who are interested in the original global menu project are now using this. Okay. On the other side of the panel, we have the indicators. This has traditionally been a real swamp in the GNOME world. It's a bit cleaner on the KDE world, but in the GNOME world, essentially, the things that went up in the panel there could do anything. They were literally independent applications that were just visually displaying themselves in the panel, but there was no kind of cohesive view of all of them. That meant that sometimes you had to right-click on the thing, sometimes you had to left-click on them, sometimes they responded to mouse movements, because they could literally do anything. You know, I mean, every event was just being sent just to some sort of application. So we've replaced that now with this idea that everything in that top right has to have particular semantics. It's basically a menu. That whole top right area now is one consistent menu. And so that has a whole bunch of benefits. For example, accessibility. If you can get the focus to there, then you can navigate around because it's just one big menu, essentially. You can even navigate between that and the application menu because it's really all just one big menu. There's a fairly standard set of patterns that you follow for the design of the icons, for example, in terms of the way you use colors, and a set of user experience patterns around that. Now that sort of looks fairly standard stuff. There are a couple of areas though where we've innovated. One of the key goals, I did a very silly thing. I sort of mailed one of the Ubuntu lists and said, hey, I need some screenshots of random desktops because I just want to get a feel for how you guys organize your desktops. And I think Foronix or someone else picked up on it. And I literally got like 2,000 emails of desktops. I got so sick and tired of right-click save as, right-click save as. And it was great though, because now, you know, it's really interesting. If you just flip through those fast, you start to sort of get a sense for common patterns in the way people have organized things. Anyway, that top space up there is really precious, and there are a lot of things that, there was a lot of clutter in that space. So we sort of said, how can we, from a design point of view, how can we really reduce the pressure on that space and clean it up? And the sort of meme was to have fewer, classier indicators. And so we came up with this idea of category indicators. We noticed that you know, there'd be an Amarok thing in there, and then be a Last FM thing in there as well, because someone likes music, so he's got Last FM and he's got Amarok, and they both each want some way to basically indicate status to the user and provide a quick shortcut way of, you know, pausing or starting or stopping the music. So we figured, well, you don't need to have two of them there. You just need one that says all my music stuff is here, and then they can sort of plug into that. And since you've already got an indicator up there that deals with noise, why not integrate it all into that? So the sound menu, for example, the sound menu, the new design for the sound menu is that it's kind of pluggable. The application can go in here, Rhythm Box can go in here, and you can have several sections of this. So if you're running both for whatever reason, if you're running Banshee and Rhythm Box, then they can both plug themselves in there. And this is implemented now in Maverick, and I think it's working quite well. Let's see. I'm muted, but you get the idea. So you have a sort of a nice, convenient way of sort of jumping through your music, pausing, playing, stopping. And now there's a whole flurry. There's a bunch of, now that API is public, there are a whole bunch of people essentially patching the common music players so that they can fit into that. Really nice. There is a standard, a debug standard called MPRIS for a media player remote interface specification or something like that. And we've had to extend that a little bit, for example, to make it possible for debug for the indicator to know about your playlists, because that wasn't in MPRIS before. But now you can go in. I don't know that I've got any playlists set up here. Okay, so you can go and pick playlists and just manage everything straight from the sound indicator. Similarly, for messaging applications, we already have a bunch of people up there that have like an email thing, and then they'd have a Gmail notifier, and then they'd have a you know, something for IRC and something for, you know, a bunch of others. So we collapsed all of that down into the messaging menu. that's sort of up here. Now, I don't know if that's in, I don't know if any of this stuff has landed in Debian yet, but this is sort of a category indicator for all messaging applications. And you can launch the applications from there as well. So from a user experience point of view, you don't have to tell someone, go into the menu and start the application and then go over here and find your email. Basically, you just always go to the messaging menu. You can open up your mail application. You can see if it's running. So this little indicator over here tells you, this little thing over here tells you that it's running. So by the end of 10.10, we should have the messaging menu, sound, session, clock, me menu, which is kind of a presence menu. It lets you manage your presence on multiple different network services. For the network menu, we hope to replace Network Manager with Connection Manager. Connection Manager is the joint Intel-Nokia effort. It's a very nice sort of back end. The separation between front end and back end is very clean. It has various other things to recommend it. But there's no GNOME sort of interface for it that we could use. So we're building a new UI onto Conman on the back end, and that's going steadily. There's a library called libindicate that you can use to put custom indicators into the panel, it's really straightforward to use because all you have to do is generate a menu. Remember, all of these things are just menus. So if you know how to create a GTK menu or a Qt menu, all you're doing is creating a menu and then saying to the indicator framework, hey, will you, here's the icon to use. Will you put up a menu or an indicator for this one? So the combination of libindicate and dbus menu works very well. There are some specific APIs also for some of the category indicators like the sound menu and the messaging menu where you specifically do describing what you want to do in there. I mean, because they're different. Each of them is different. And we also had to build a piece of technology to allow menus to be specified in desktop files. And the reason for that is that we wanted to be able to expose some actions that the application could do if it was running when it wasn't running. When the application's running, of course, it can connect over dbus and say, here's the menu that I want you to display. But we have to have some way of knowing what menu to describe when it's not running. So, for example, I think these things over here, the menus are displayed even though the mail application isn't running at the moment. So the launcher, this was the big chunk of new work that landed in May. The launcher uses Clutter very heavily, so a lot of the animations and effects around it are Clutter-based. It uses GL directly quite heavily, so a lot of the glow effects are rendered in GL. Try and offload as much of the processing onto the GPU as possible. And this has been really the focus of a lot of the user experience design work. There's a hell of a lot that you have to encapsulate in that. Is something running? Is something calling for attention? Is something? How many windows are there associated with a particular application? Which window has the focus right now? There's a lot of sort of rich semantic content that has to be distilled down. So it's been quite a long design process, but it's come together very nicely, and I think people will be happy with 10.10. A couple of new technologies had to be built for that. There's a framework called BAMF. I have no idea why it's called BAMF. But essentially it's a new model for tracking applications in Windows. This is like unbelievably horrible under X as it is today. But just knowing what applications are displayed, what window actually has the focus and so on is really quite tricky. And so BAMF takes care of a lot of the details there. We reused, again, dbus menu and the .desktop file menu definition structure that we had from the indicators work. We reused that for quick lists. So you can go in, for example, and you've got a capability like that. And that comes from, that's, again, using the same technologies. And because the menus can be specified in desktop files, they can be present even if the application isn't running. It's implemented at the moment as a Mutter plugin. So Mutter is Metacity plus clutter. So you've got kind of clutter on top of clutter, all in a spectacular attempt to make an uncluttered interface, with lots of sort of trying to pass through clutter to get to the underlying GL. And then this last piece, the dash and what we call places. This is again implemented in clutter. The architecture here is you have a complete separation between the thing that's doing the rendering the interface and the daemons that are essentially producing data to be rendered. They talk to each other over dbus, and it's designed so that you can have multiple things going on at the same time, because you may well want to issue a query, a search query, for example, over lots of places. So you might say, show me, find files like this, and that might shoot off to Google and do one query and kick some processes off looking at what's on your hard disk, and send some other thread spinning off to Amazon, and you want to integrate all of that. So it's designed to have lots of things going on, and synthesized and rendered by something that won't easily get distracted from the rendering. There's a library there called libd. Libd basically defines the data model of what can be rendered over there, and then libunity is kind of a command set up and take down library. So if you want to put your own content into the dash like this, then you create your own daemon that talks to it. It uses libunity to sort of register itself, and then it uses libd to publish the data that it wants rendered. You can also plug into the dash itself custom renderers, so they will take the data from off dbus and then render it in an appropriate way. So using dbus for everything allows us to do stuff in a way that's really quite nice from a cross-desktop perspective. So you could, for example, write a Qt implementation of exactly the same thing and use all the same places daemons, just rendering in Qt. And or if you didn't want to use clutter, for example, because you didn't have the graphical horsepower, then you could just do it in GTK as well. So separating out the representation, the display, the rendering from the actual data model has proved quite useful to us already in that regard. And that's it. So Etana is the name that we gave the sort of overall design initiative. We called it that because it's the word that sort of Zen Buddhists use for awareness. So the thinking is that we've lots of great applications, and the application, when you're working on an application, that application defines what you're concentrated on. But then there's all this other stuff going on around that, things like notifications, things like your system status, whether you're connected, what's happening with your battery, and so on and so forth. And that's kind of in your peripheral awareness. And so that's where the term Etana comes from. It's all open source, all hosted on launchpad.net, and should ship for 10.10 Netbook edition. Are there any questions? Yeah. Not yet, no.
Sound.
There we go.
My name is Kai Hendry. I do Linux distribution for Web Converger. Should try it out. My question is, I believe that Ubuntu is the base for Google Chrome, and I couldn't help but think to myself all the time that surely Google Chrome is aiming for netbooks and doing very similar things. So I was just wondering, are you working together? Are you looking at what they're doing? Are you?
So the Chrome OS team did start with Ubuntu as a sort of development environment, but they've moved on from there. I think for Chrome OS, their desire was to sort of build more in the same sort of way you build an embedded device. So they've actually switched to Portage, Gen 2 Portage as a build system.
Oh, you really like that.
Right. So this this stage I'm no expert at all on the sort of architecture or approach that they've taken, and there hasn't been much cross-pollination from a user experience point of view either. Chrome OS for quite a long time. I don't know how it's coming along. Well, they'll get there. Yeah.
You said earlier on that you were looking at search and touch as the primary interface into you said at the beginning you're looking at search and touch as the primary interface in Unity. And I'm curious how you, especially when we're talking about a touch-based device that has no keyboard, how you think of balancing that out. In particular, how does the search part work if all you're doing is touching?
So any substantial touch device is going to have an on-screen keyboard, but you don't want, I think the real key there is that you don't want to have to type a lot, right? So it's about two things. First, it's about the way that search is presented in the interface, like how hard is it to get to where you can start searching. And then also it's about the quality of your search. You know, if I can just type 3 letters on a tablet touch screen, it's an unsatisfying way to type, right? Finger, finger, finger. But if I don't have to do a lot of it, then that's probably acceptable.
But are you exploring ways to perhaps be able to start search in a way without using keyboard at all?
It sounds well.
It's an oxymoron in a way, I suppose.
To a certain extent, yes. If you look at this, you kind of tell us where you want to be searching, and so we could potentially bring stuff into hot cache. So this is a view of the applications. So this is what replaces essentially all those menus in the current shell. So if you're searching here, we know you're searching for applications, and we can search first across the things installed. That's fast, and then slightly more slowly we can search, things that aren't yet installed, and then even more slowly we can go search the web for stuff that don't yet know about, but that might match. I can't think of any other cunning ways we could start to search before you've typed anything, but the telepathy module isn't implemented yet. Yeah, so just back there.
Hi, I'm glad to hear that you're working on search a lot more as an interface, and I think and I think it's really useful. One thing that I find a little scary is if you say that it's like getting rid of hierarchies. So hierarchies as the primary interface, I think, are pretty flawed. But certain people, we humans have this remarkable ability to like keep a map of physical space in our brains, as some people and others. Like you see people who have incredibly messy offices and can find stuff. And I think that in a way hierarchies kind of represent that. So like I think it's good to focus, put maybe more of the focus on search, but you can't replace everything.
That's interesting. So I think I agree with you where you've got natural categories, natural categorization, especially where you've got categorization that's common across lots of different people's machines. So a little bit of that, the internet category, the office category of software, and letting people inviting people to kind of come in and have a look and see what's there. Sometimes when you make search the only way to find something, people don't know how imaginative they can be. You know what I mean? Search for teleportation machine. You wouldn't, because you couldn't possibly believe that anybody could have one. What is interesting though is how something that's perfectly natural for most of us, which is directories, files, and other directories, is astonishingly difficult, or just astonishingly broken for typical end users. So I saw that first. I actually sat and watched people using the system, and often you'd see things like, for example, people would receive a file by email, and they would save it, and then they would want to either email that file to someone else or open it in some other application, and they couldn't find it. They'd been presented with all of the information they needed to complete that task, but it just didn't stick in some way. So I just noticed it on as we were watching user testing of off the street, and sort of intellectual arrogance that immediately kicks in, where you say, well, ordinary users don't understand this stuff, but I'm fine, right? And then I started to observe just my own use of it, and I spent a lot of time trawling through, especially where I've got disks of lots of stuff that I know, like photograph collections and things like that. It's on the disk. I know it's on the disk, but I can't exactly remember whether it was, how I'd organized it at that particular time. Especially over years, when you've got data that you've built up over years. I don't know if you guys have a similar experience. So I'm getting older, getting dumber, so I need to try and get the software usable by the time I hit my 70s, so that it's a personal mission. So I'm really coming around to the view that actually, even for the very smartest users, that may be a waste of their smarts. Like if we can just get it so that you can start typing and get what you want, that's much better. I think there are a lot of gaps that we have to close in that, but that's kind of where I think we have to get to. And I think the web has taught us that it's possible to do an amazingly good job with search. Let's just sort of see if we can come back to that. I don't know that I'm yet ready to say make the file system opaque, but there are many cases where, for example, you really shouldn't hit the file system. For that case of someone who got emailed a document, saved it, and then tried to open a document in something else, the way the file place is built to work, for example, see the stuff that I have been working on, most recently, immediately, and then I can search on top of that, very quickly, very efficiently. At least that's the design thinking. I mean, the nice thing about we've got this real flourishing at the moment. The Migo guys are doing really interesting work. I don't know if anybody's looked at it. It's radically different. It's really cool. It's innovative. There's Android out there. Unity, I think, is pioneering certain things. There's the GNOME shell. If you've looked at their design, it's also quite different. So KDE4. So this is actually a very interesting time for innovation and creativity. And I'm pretty sure that we'll all emerge from it in 2 or 3 years' time very happy.
I was just, as you were mentioning about search and about finding things, I was thinking about something I was reading about. It's being developed, I guess, Zeitgeist.
Yeah. So Zeitgeist powers this.
Oh, okay. Sorry.
Yeah. Again, the Zeitgeist guys, they started out on really coming from the Ubuntu community. Dave Lotfi is kind of the lead champion on that. And I'm right, George, we embraced Zeitgeist pretty much immediately. We've used it, and they've been debating its adoption in GNOME. I don't know what the latest on that is. Not yet. Not yet. So again, that's sort of useful. That we have embraced Zeitgeist means that we'll kick the guys out. If it works well, then we'll prove that GNOME might be more likely to use it. Maybe KDE would be more likely to use it. Conceptually, it's really interesting. Zeitgeist is a way of organizing metadata about how you're using stuff and when you're using it and where you're using it. So potentially, for example, you can walk into a room and say, and when you hit that button, that top button over there, you see the files that you last looked at when you were in that room, or in Central Park, or in the coffee shop. So it's just a really interesting project to sort of rethink the metadata that we track about what files we're using together. For example, when I was reading this email, I was surfing that website, so that kind of correlation. So yeah, Zeitgeist is absolutely embedded in there.
So have you thought all about how you want to cope with layer mode search? I've certainly seen users who can't find things, at least on the web, where because they just can't guess the right keyword, they aren't thinking about it the right way in order to do the search. Is there some way that you can, in the interface, say, search is totally not looking for me, I need to switch out of search mode into some sort of hierarchical mode, or at least I can eventually LS our entire tree and find it that way?
Yeah, this is big of this tree. The semantic structure of what you see on the screen is that you've got the place entries, which are those sort of chunks at the top. We're actually going to move those things down. On my screen, we've actually moved the places down into the launcher itself, as an experiment to see how that works for us. But so you can have multiple place entries. It's the sort of top of your structure, and then inside of that you have sections. So you can't see it on here, but you would see it on. Let's see it up there. So there are sections over there, and then you actually have groups as well. So that's the kind of hierarchical structure, and you can nest quite deeply into that. And then the semantics as to how you search, so that you can just search just inside a thing, or search everything. It's not. We're not trying to build a file browser. We're not trying to build a better Nautilus. So I think we'd probably set limits on how much we would try to support that kind of, click-through trawling. I'd much rather invest that energy into getting the search right.
Mark, I'm going to give you your oh no, it's Kurt moment. First, you mentioned about getting things right before you're 7. Christine and I would like you to come and meet our 2 new children, Dinner and Harvest. So we've got genetically ready organs for us. My question sort of relates to all of this. Do you think you run the risk of, by simplifying this interface to such an extent, that you start giving users the impression that their new Ubuntu or their new Linux or their new whatever this is on their computer that they haven't seen before, this is a simple operating system? And when you want to get real work done, that's when you reach for the Vista or Windows 7 CD or OS 10 CD. And that what this is mostly meant for is it's a utility operating system. It doesn't really do that much. Do you see any sort of potential problem there? And if so, how do you plan to address it?
Look, I think it's really hard to argue against simplicity. Even people who have really complicated, important, big, heavy-duty things to get done don't really want the rest of the operating system crowding in on them while they're trying to get that done. I had a really interesting experience. My folks have always had, my dad, for example, has always had an Ubuntu PC. Well, for the last 6 years, he's had an Ubuntu PC and a Windows laptop. He needed the Windows laptop was sort of dying, so I got him a new one, and I didn't even think about it. I just with Windows on it, and anyway, 2 or 3 days after we set it up, he came over and he said, "Listen, do you mind installing Ubuntu on that new laptop? Because it's much easier to use." And I think a lot of easy to use is a question of familiarity and so on and so forth on the one hand, but on the other hand, I think we really are getting to the point where the user interfaces for Linux are genuinely easier to use than the stuff that's been built up and built up and built up in the Windows environment, where they can't afford to change too much, and where there are sort of other pressures on like the pressures on OEMs to install more software before they ship it, which inevitably makes it more crowded and slower. So yeah, there is a chance that if we put kind of crisp, clean, clear things on there, people think of them as devices and therefore not as sort of powerful or general purpose computers. But I suspect the flip side is more likely, that people want to spend more of their time using this device just because whenever they want to get something done, they can quickly get it done. At least that's the goal.
And if I could just add, I mean, if you're talking about the notion of a simple interface, and people say, oh, that can only do simple things. I mean, I remember when OS X came out, that was exactly the reaction that a lot of people had to it. You look at the screen, it's got this 5 things sitting at the bottom, and it hasn't seemed to have gotten in the way of people also. They can also use it for serious work as well.
Yes, but I was very, very adept at manufacturing desire and need, and in our community is not.
Well, so what it said is that Apple is good at making something that people lust after, that they want to use. Wouldn't it be nice if they felt that way about Debian? And that's what this project is all about, right? Because if we get this right and Debian ships it, then I think people will feel this way. It'll feel like, wow, this is fantastic. I think we're in a position to be better than Apple. That's the goal we set 2 years ago. I think we've got another 2 years till 1204. Squeeze plus 1. Thanks. And let's get it done. Yeah.
So I really like it that you're improving search, but I find that when I search for files, there's 2 modalities. If I know something about the file, then it might be worth searching for it. But often you don't. You're just fishing for something. And then, like someone was saying there, there's a territory in there, and it's gonna be in there no matter what you do, because for the inside stuff, it's still gonna be there, right? So I thought it was a bit weird. You said, I'm not yet thinking about making it opaque, but why would you ever? Because it seems to me that they're orthogonal, right? I mean, make search as good as you can. Maybe somebody else wants to make the hierarchy easily browsable. I think our browsers...
There's room, I think, for alternative sort of storage models. I don't know if you guys have ever worked at one of those sort of big firms where they have these, effectively they've replaced the file save as dialogue, like in lawyers, for example, with something that basically maps to this huge document management system that they've got, where you can, they track every file, like I said, which client, which case, which, etc., right? So obviously, in a firm of 500 lawyers, all of whom could be working on different cases for different clients and so on, over a 20-year period, you don't just want arbitrary people making up a file hierarchy. So they've built these systems that are sort of really custom, purpose-built storage systems just for them. What's interesting is that the world today, you've got hierarchical files and folders, or those custom things. And I think what we're going to move to is more like you've got search as the standard, and then if you want, you could potentially have hierarchical files and folders interface where you set it up and you craft it that way, and you still also have those sort of more industry-specific, vertical market-specific storage or document management systems as well. So yes, I guess I'm agreeing. I think there will always be room for someone who wants to create files and folders and do it that way. But I think we can improve the experience dramatically for the average user who, in a week, we may actually process no more than a couple of hundred files. It's not that much. And so it's easily within what we can handle from a search perspective. And we can take away all the burden for you of having to track that. Where did that go? What happened to the file? What did I do? I got this over IRC. With Zeitgeist, we could track, for example, yes, you got that in a file from this person, so you can start searching from the name of the person and see the file that they sent you, that sort of thing. It's just much richer. Let the computer do the work.
The way I tend to work with files is either in two ways. Either I have a specific file, like a photograph, that's its own item, its own identity, and I have these which are really full folders of other files. And the way, of course, the way we have a file system means that all of things are organized in the same way. The classification for one photograph is in a folder because I classify it in certain ways. Or this folder that actually contains a project full of files is also a full folder because of the technology that we're using. But actually, when I think about it, the project is one thing, even though it's a full folder. And Mac does this with their applications and their other DMGs and other various properties where they have archives as these items, and then you can search for the archives, and that makes more sense. Whereas when you go into those objects and you have folders, Debian folder and your project folder, that's when you need the navigation, the hierarchies, and the various other things, because you do have a collection and you are thinking about the whole thing as an item. Whereas when you're thinking about your photographs, it's only when you start to think about galleries and maybe printing all of them out as a collection that kind of, you need to have a more structured view.
Right.
I was wondering what your thoughts are about collections and whether we should be searching for collections.
I think collections are actually tricky because often we don't ingest enough metadata in them for search to necessarily be easy. If you went on holiday and you took 50 pictures, you may well not write enough about them in metadata and so on to be able to separate between them. You can quickly get to the collection, holiday in Spain, oof, but you not so easily get to one of the 2,000 pictures that you have in mind. I guess the online services have have a huge advantage because they start to have enough data and enough compute power. They can, look at the photographs and do face recognition. So you can say, show me photos of Jenny, and out come photos of Jenny without you having had to mark them up. I don't have any brilliant ideas on that, but I can can believe this sort of idea that in some settings you want to work with collections, and that this model isn't going to work very well for that. I can certainly believe that. Scott?
So I was just following up on what you just said. You've got basic metadata in there. You've got when the photo was taken, where the photo was taken. You've got who's in the photo, how many people in the photo. There's a whole bunch of metadata the user doesn't have to put in.
Right, that you can do through either inspecting the thing or exit. Yeah.
That's what I was saying.
We've got, 2-3 minutes left.
I became a Debian user when I updated app to Debian. So, and I know, like, usually a lot of Debian users, they think of Ubuntu as this whole sister project that just took away some of the publicity. But actually, to me, because I came through Ubuntu, it means a lot, like a path that Ubuntu was huge publicly, and then it brought me to the world of Debian. Now, when Canonical says that they're going to, you spoke earlier and you said that Canonical would, partner with OEMs to provide this as like a second OS, or for netbooks. And I was just wondering if you could, elaborate on that and just explain what kind of plans you have. And I assume, of course, Canonical is a for-profit company, so they have some business plans, which, is perfectly, is of course part of the, whole thing. So I'm just wondering, what kind of ideas or the future.
Well, first, thank you for sharing the story of, meeting Ubuntu and then going on to Debian. I think that's quite a common pattern now. This is quite a fun DebConf for me because I've been doing it 6 years now, and so know lots of great people, but also because it's much harder to tell lines of affiliation. You know what I mean? Because there are a lot of people who spend time with Ubuntu, spend time with Debian, upload packages to both places, etc., etc. So your story, I think, is a common one, and makes everybody's life easier. So add your name to one of the lists of contributions to Debian. I'd be appreciative. We're now shipping millions of PCs around the world every year with Ubuntu pre-installed, with a Debian derivative pre-installed. I see no reason why that number won't grow by an order of magnitude. Just if I look at the dynamics there, we've got Windows XP expiring. There's huge and growing demand for computing in parts of the world that have never had it, so therefore that aren't quite as prejudiced against, so heavily attached to Windows as folks would be. And also, what people want to get done with computers is changing. It's amazing. It's been a very long time since anybody said to me, "But I can't run Office on it." You know what I mean? It's much less an issue now, and the diminishing issue. But we've got the web to thank for that. So while I can't go into the specific plans I might have with a particular vendor, last year or the year before, Microsoft came out and said, that Linux on a netbook was dead. That was, I think, a slightly premature declaration of victory on their behalf. So then, we continue to want to take free software to the whole world. And this year will be a good one for that. And one last question I got.
Okay, very specific question about the messaging indicator. I've been using it on one of my computers. It collapses email, Twitter, and chat. Three completely different things that have different time you want to respond to. Maybe very quickly, is there any thing about splitting them up, or is there a very specific reason why they are together?
Yeah, there is a sort of nagging inconsistency in the relationship between the messaging menu and the presence menu. Presence menu is, say, for example, I want to be signed into this IRC channel, and I want to be online or change my status and so on. And the messaging menu is where you deal with sort of responses coming through that. And so it may be that in future we map the kind of instant messaging, real-time sort of stuff over to the presence menu. We haven't figured that out. It's kind of an open question. We debate it. There just hasn't been, nobody's put forward anything that we can all look at. Oh, that's exactly right. I think the critical thing with the messaging menu application decides to use the facilities. The facilities that the messaging menu exposes there's a section per application, and they can put, I think, up to 7 entries in that. So the initial, if you, for example, if your mail application put the names of the last 7 people who sent you email, it wouldn't be that useful. Mail, you probably want to get a sense of how much mail there is, 20 unread messages or something like that. However, if your mail application had the ability for you to sort of tag some people in your address book and say, I want to know when this person sends me an email, that would be useful. So you could go and have a look and you see immediately, oh, I've got mail from Matt, or I've got mail from Jane. That would be useful, and you can go straight to that message, if you have a sort of an important. And then the other facility, which is a shared facility, is that you can, not online now, but if I went online, for example, and someone pinged me, and I, wasn't looking at the chat window, then that would go green. So there's a way of basically saying there is a message in here that needs your attention. And again, it's a question of how sophisticated the app is in how it uses that facility. If the app just goes green all the time, then you're kind of simmering the facility. Anyway, we're out of time. Thank you very much, and nice to be here.